In this book, this author interview with Professor Engelsma, we're going to deal with two books, and more or less in this order. First, The Covenant of God and the Children of Believers, subtitled Sovereign Grace in the Covenant, a doctrinal study, if you will. And in this one, The Battle for Sovereign Grace in the Covenant, the Declaration of Principles, which takes the doctrine of the covenant and explains how it played out in a church controversy in the Protestant Reformed churches in America in and around 1953, in a particular document of a Protestant Reformed Synod entitled The Declaration of Principles. Both books are actually the same price, £15 each. Professor Engelsma, what is the Reformed view of the children of believers and their place in the covenant of God?
That question of the place of the children of believers in the covenant of God is, and has been for centuries, a highly controversial subject. Obviously, it has been a highly controversial subject in the division of the Baptists from the Reformed and Presbyterian churches, evident in the refusal of the Baptists to have their children baptized, whereas the Reformed and Presbyterians baptize their children. But this issue of the place of the children of believers in the covenant of God has also been highly controversial within the Reformed community of churches, and continues to be controversial in the Reformed community of churches. The difference between the Reformed and the Baptist can be quickly and readily stated and easily understood. The Reformed believe that their children are included in the covenant of grace that God makes with them as believers. The Baptists deny that. At least the Baptists deny that the children are included as children, and particularly as infant children. The controversy within the Reformed churches that continues to rage, and I use that verb advisedly. There is in North America, especially today, a raging controversy over this very issue, occasioned by a movement of teaching that calls itself the federal vision, meaning, of course, the covenant vision, over this very issue. But I say the controversy within the Reformed churches has been a raging controversy for many years and is not settled decisively to this day. In the Reformed community, the issue basically comes down to this: does God save the infant children of believers as children, even in their infancy, or does God include the children of believers in the covenant merely in the sense that they are included in a family where it is more likely that they will be converted later on after they have been taught the truth and believe the truth? This latter position maintains that the children of believers remain lost and unsaved until such a time as they grow up and show themselves to be believers. And I maintain that position is virtually indistinguishable from the Baptist position. But the book that we're discussing at present, The Covenant of God and the Children of Believers, proposes and defends, in the light of Scripture and the Reformed confessions, that the covenant of God with believing parents incorporates and includes the children of believing parents as well as the parents, and that this inclusion of the children of believing parents in the covenant refers to children in their infancy, at their birth, as it were, and therefore is not to be restricted to the salvation of the children of believers who may later on be converted and confess their faith in Jesus Christ. And the argument of this book is that infant baptism, which all Reformed and Presbyterian churches practice or have practiced in the past. Nowadays there's such departure in all areas that one can hardly safely say that all Reformed and Presbyterian churches do that. But it certainly is the Reformed tradition to baptize the infant children of believers. That baptism of the infant children of believers signifies and seals that God makes his covenant with the children of believers as well as with believers, and that this making of his covenant with the children of believers implies or means that God also saves these children in their infancy, regenerating them by his Holy Spirit, uniting them to Jesus Christ, washing them from their sins. And one practical, very practical implication of this is creedal with Reformed Christians. In the canons of Dort, one of the official creeds of Reformed churches and of the Protestant Reformed churches, of which I am a member, in the first head of Doctrine, the 17th article, declares that believing parents have no reason to doubt the salvation of their children who die in infancy, and grounds that in God's making his covenant with the children of believers. Now, the objection to the view that I have just described as the truth of the matter is that obviously not every one of the children of believers shows himself or herself to be saved, and some fall away from the truth and from the church and walk with the wicked world and finally perish with the wicked world. And the argument is that because that happens to some, that's proof that the inclusion of the children of believers does not mean the salvation of the children of believers. But the answer to that objection, the biblical answer to that objection, which this book spells out in detail, is that God's promise to be the God of believers and their children, and that covenant promise is the basis for the Reformed confession that children should be baptized and that children are included in the covenant. The promise of God to be the God of believers and their children is intended by God to refer to the elect children of believers, and not to all of the children of believers head for head. The elect children of believers are the true spiritual children of believing parents. And them God includes in his covenant, and God saves generally, not necessarily in every case, already in their infancy. And that's why John the Baptist would leap for joy at the presence of Jesus Christ already when he was in his mother's womb, before he was born, as we read in Luke 1.
That's a good scriptural proof. Do you have any other biblical arguments, Prof, for the position you've been presenting?
There is the testimony of Romans 9 that God loved Jacob before Jacob was even born. God's covenant with the children of Isaac and Rebekah meant that God loved Jacob. And if he loved Jacob before Jacob was born, Jacob was saved already before he was born. And that accounts for the struggle in Rebekah's womb between Jacob and his twin brother Esau. Jacob, as a regenerated child already in his mother's womb, in a mysterious and unconscious way, directed nevertheless by the revelatory, providential, and predestinating will of God, was desirous to have the promise of the covenant before he was born. He was willing to fight for the covenant and the riches of the covenant. To my mind, that also is an evidence of the truth that God's covenant is with the believers and their children, and that means the salvation of the children in their infancy. There's something similar to that about Jeremiah the prophet in Jeremiah chapter 1, I believe.
Yes. So you referred to Canons 117. There's confessional support. Jeremiah, John the Baptist, Jacob, all begin with J. Not that that's significant, just occurs to me for memorizing. There's support for this in the Reformed tradition, of course, and one of the best books that summarizes and lists the Reformed support for this truth about children in the covenant is a book by Louis Bevins Schenck, treated in your book in pages 222 through 226, appendix number 3. The title of the work is The Presbyterian Doctrine of Children in the Covenant, an historical study of the significance of infant baptism in the Presbyterian Church. The same could be done for the Reformed line. I think it's fair to say, Prof, that you like that book.
I like that book a great deal, and especially because it's common today for defenders of the position that infant baptism only means that the children of believers are more likely to be saved when they grow up because of their family circumstances and because of the instruction they receive. It's common for them to argue that that view is the traditional Presbyterian and Calvinistic view. And that book by Bevan Schenck, is that his name? Mm-hmm. Argues and demonstrates that the historic and creedal Presbyterian view of children in the covenant has always been the salvation of children in their infancy who are the children of believing parents. And as you mentioned, there are other notable theologians whose teaching about this matter is powerful evidence that the mainstream of Reformed theology from Calvin down has been both the inclusion of children in the covenant and the salvation of elect children in their earliest childhood and infancy. Now you ask about biblical proof. I think there's a biblical proof of this that is so obvious that many people miss it. And that is the Fifth Commandment of the law of God. And for more than one reason. Honor your father and mother, as explained by Ephesians 6, verses 1 and following. honor your parents in the Lord, because this is pleasing to the Lord. You don't start telling your children from God's law, honor your father and mother for God's sake when they're 15 or 16 and can make a decision for Christ, as the Arminian likes to emphasize. You start teaching your child this when your child is 2 or 3 years old. Not simply honor your father and mother because otherwise you'll get a spanking, but honor your father and mother because this is pleasing to God. This is what God calls you to do as one of His children. That's how you rear children as believing. That's how, as believing parents, you rear your children. That's the biblical requirement of believing parents. Tell your children this. The Bible tells them that in Ephesians 6. Honor your father and mother in the Lord, for this is pleasing to the Lord. So, how can they do that if they're not saved? That's utterly impossible. You can't tell your child to honor you, not in the biblical sense, if that child is an unsaved, unregenerated, ungodly child. He has no disposition to that. He has no ability to that. But the second aspect of that truth is that the Fifth Commandment isn't just part of a law of morality. It's part of the law of God to His chosen, redeemed people, whom He has delivered from the bondage of Egypt by the redemption of the cross and then by the sanctifying power of the Holy Spirit. These people have no other gods before Him. And included in this people are the children of believers who, because they have God as their God in their childhood already, are called to honor Him and are able to honor Him. It seems to me that truth embodied in the Fifth Commandment stares every Christian in the face and confronts them with the truth that the children of believers are included in the covenant of God, today as in the time of Israel.
I think it's particularly sad in our day that though this is the truth of the Reformed creeds and the Reformers and their successors, including Charles Hodge, the great Presbyterian in the States, most people in the British Isles who are evangelicals think the Baptist view is the only option. And then if they get a hold of something of the Reformed faith, they come to the weaker Reformed view whereby they're externally in the covenant. And that's all that it means when your children are baptized. And if they come to hear about the genuine position of Calvin, the Reformed confessions and the historic, the best line of the Reformed and Presbyterian tree, it's so strange to them that people charge that view with baptismal regeneration or presumptive regeneration. Sometimes that terminology has been used badly by some, when what they mean is promised regeneration of the elect. And that's the value of Shank's book for me too. I wanted to ask Prof about part 4 of this book. It's important in itself, and also it leads us into the next book. Part 4 of Covenant of God and the Children of Believers is entitled The Canadian Reformed or Liberated Objection to What You've Been Saying. And as the chapter headings make clear, their charge is that this is making election the equivalent of the covenant. How would you respond to that?
Your remarks bring out that not only is there a positive development of the truth expressed by the title of the book, but there is also a taking up in the book of the errant views, the main errant views of this truth of the place of children in the covenant as these main errant views surface in various denominations or types of the Christian religion, forms of the Christian religion. The Baptist position is examined, tested, and refuted. There's a denomination of Reformed churches known as the Netherlands Reformed Congregations, although due to various splits, somewhat different names are taken by this denomination. They share the view that in spite of the fact that God promises to establish his covenant with the children of believers, and in what I regard as virtual contempt for the sacrament of infant baptism, they maintain that the children of believers are dead and remain dead until such a time as they have a conversion experience when they grow up and become teenagers. And in that, as I remark in the book, they are unfortunately good disciples of Jonathan Edwards, who in spite of all of his virtues and in spite of some of his other sound writings, was woefully weak and misleading with regard to the subject of the book, the place of children in the covenant of God. Famously, he declared about the children of believers, famously and almost blasphemously, in my judgment, that they're little vipers. That's all they are. Sprinkle the water of God's sacrament of baptism on them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, a sign of the covenant, and condemn them as little vipers, little descendants of Satan, rather than as little children of God. But among the views that this book regards and exposes as erroneous is the view that you referred to, the view of the Canadian Reformed churches, who are a daughter of the Reformed churches in the Netherlands, Liberated, whose most well-known theologian was Dr. Klaas Schilder. And I examined that view as well, because that's quite a popular view, a view that they aggressively disseminate among the Reformed churches, especially in North America. Their view is that God makes his covenant with every child of believing parents, head for head. And the establishment of that covenant with every child head for head, although some of them are more cautious in stating this than others, but from their writings it becomes evident that God does this because he has an attitude of grace towards them, and as Schilder himself said, wills that child's salvation, and even begins, in certain respects, the work of salvation within that child. The covenant that God establishes with all the children of believers is conditional. That term is extremely important in their covenant conception and in what I regard as the important controversy that the sound Reformed faith on this matter has with them. The covenant is conditional. It depends upon whether the child, when he comes to years, and they never describe what that age is, but when that child becomes older, it depends on whether that child will accept the covenant and agree to the terms of the covenant and fulfill the conditions of the covenant, which are faith and lifelong obedience. If a child will fulfill that condition, then God will maintain the covenant with that child that he made and save that child. But if the child fails to fulfill the conditions, fails to believe and fails to obey, which many children do, then the covenant of God with that child is broken or dissolved, and that child perishes outside the covenant. And the Protestant Reformed churches, and I in this book, in the examination of that view of the covenant, condemn it as basically the introduction of the Arminian heresy into the realm of the covenant. Conditional covenant. That's a covenant that is not purely gracious, a covenant that is established and realized and maintained by God alone, so that the faith of the child is not a condition that the child performs, really a work of the child upon which the covenant depends, but the faith of our children is a covenant gift of God to them because of God's making of the covenant with them and the expression and fruit of his uniting them to Jesus Christ in the bond of the covenant already when they were not able consciously to believe in their mother's womb or in infancy. So that this is not merely a theological dispute without any real importance, but this is a controversy, this is an issue, the salvation of our children, that touches the gospel of grace. Is the gospel of God gracious with our children? If it's conditional, it isn't gracious. And it's my judgment that at Dort, and in the canons of Dort explicitly, the Reformed faith condemns conditional salvation as being contrary to the gospel of salvation by free and sovereign grace. Protestant Reformed churches in some, and that's the view that I espouse and defend in the book, with appeal to the creeds and scripture and certain Reformed theologians of note. This is not a sideline in the Reformed tradition. This is in the mainstream of the Reformed tradition. God makes his covenant with us and with our children, of which their baptism and their infancy is a sign. In the confidence of that and in the hope of that, we raise all our children to love, fear, and serve God. We call them all to believe in Jesus Christ. We call them all to obey God by honoring their parents in particular. And God blesses that instruction in the salvation of our elect children from their earliest years on, as a rule, so that they grow up knowing, loving, serving, and walking in God's ways. But predestination, election, and reprobation apply to the children of believers as well as to different groups of adult human beings, as the Old Testament example of Jacob and Esau illustrates perfectly, so that there may be among our physical children, children who are reprobate and who despise the promise of God that isn't made to them personally, but that they nevertheless hear and refuse to walk in God's ways and perish, sadly, but according to their own fault and guilt.
Professor, we haven't and aren't going to touch upon part 5 of this book, though it's a very worthy part of the book, which deals with the federal vision, error regarding the covenant of God, the children of believers, and indeed their denial of the doctrines of grace in general. We dealt with that in an interview you gave on your book, Federal Vision, Heresy at the Root. Could we just mention it here with regard to this particular book?
I
Because
appreciate that, because I might make just this statement,
Okay.
that part of the book dealing with the current controversy that is raging in virtually all of the Reformed and Presbyterian churches in North America, especially the more conservative Presbyterian and Reformed churches, concerns a heretical teaching that holds that one may once have been saved and yet fall away and perish everlastingly, because the covenant of God is conditional. And that particular false doctrine, which denies openly and overtly all 5 points of Calvinism as they might apply to the children of believers, is and advertises itself as being a development of the conditional covenant of the Reformed churches in the Netherlands liberated and of the Canadian Reformed churches in North America.
This second work, The Battle for Sovereign Grace and the Covenant, subtitled The Declaration of Principles. What is the Declaration of Principles?
The Declaration of Principles is a synodical decision that the Protestant Reformed churches in America took in 1951 and in 1953. It made the basic decision in 1951, but defended it against protests against it in 1953. That synodical decision, which is some 7 or 8 pages long in small print in the original Acts of Synod, where the decision was recorded, affirms that the covenant of God is with the elect children of believers only, and that covenant of God with the elect children of believers, as with believers themselves, is unconditional. That is, it does not depend upon the faith and obedience of the children for its realization and its fulfillment. But the realization and fulfillment of the covenant promise, I will be your God, which includes all of salvation, depends solely upon the grace of the promising God and the power of the grace of the promising God, as grounded in the atonement of Jesus Christ and as is effectuated by the Almighty Spirit of Jesus Christ. That decision was taken in a controversy that the Protestant Reformed churches were embroiled in the late 1940s and early 1950s, an internal doctrinal controversy over the nature of the covenant, whether the covenant of God is conditional or unconditional, whether the covenant of God is determined and controlled by election, or whether the covenant of God really has nothing to do with election at all, but is much wider than is God's decree of election.
So does this mean that the Protestant Reformed churches, unlike all the other Reformed churches, hold to the 4 forms of unity? That you have the Belgic Confession of 1561, the Heidelberg Catechism of 1563, the Canons of Dort of 1618, 1619, and the Declaration of Principles 1951. The 4 forms of unity. Is that what you have?
That question perceptively reflects a charge that was made against the Protestant Reformed churches at the time of the adoption of the Declaration of Principles, and that has been repeated and is still being repeated in published form, in fact, as recently as a couple of years ago in a book on the subject of the covenant, namely that the Protestant Reformed churches have added a creed to the accepted Reformed creeds. My response to that charge is, first of all, it isn't outlawed that a denomination of churches makes creedal statements anymore, as if the right of the church to make creedal statements ended in 1618, 1619. Or that it isn't necessary, again, after the 17th century for a church to adopt creeds. Situations may arise that make it necessary for the Church of Jesus Christ to make new creeds and adopt new creedal statements. Although if it does that, it should first try to have other churches cooperate in the drawing up of those creeds. But it isn't an unforgivable sin to make creedal professions this late in the history of the church. And if a church might do that, the fact that it does that does not all by itself show that action by the church to have been illegitimate. But in the second place, and that's more to the point, the Declaration of Principles is not a fourth confession and did not intend to be a fourth confession and has not been regarded as a fourth confession. It is rather, as it claims to be, an explanation of what the three forms of unity, the three adopted Reformed confessions, teach on this controversial issue, whether the covenant is conditional or unconditional. It's an explanation and application of the creeds to this issue. The question that the Declaration of Principles answered was, what do the creeds teach with regard to the relation of election and the covenant, and then specifically with regard to the conditionality or unconditionality of the covenant. I would say almost 90% of the Declaration of Principles is quotation of the creeds. There's very little further explanation of the creeds at all in the Declaration.
And Professor Engelsma, you said this was an internal struggle in the PRC, and this internal struggle took place some 60 plus years ago. So, is this of any value for anybody else outside the PRC today?
It's my considered judgment that the Declaration of Principles is of great importance to the Reformed churches today, and in that conviction I wrote the book, which doesn't so much give the history of that struggle, although it does give a good deal of the history of that struggle. And the book, by the way, includes the Declaration of Principles itself for the Reformed church world to read, as well as a short commentary on the Declaration of Principles that I have drawn up, the only commentary on that synodical decision in existence as far as I know. But I'm saying that it's my conviction that the Declaration of Principles is of vital importance to the Reformed community of churches today. And the reason for that is that the issue settled by the Declaration of Principles is a vital issue and continues to be a highly controversial issue, an issue that causes controversy to rage in Reformed churches, Reformed denominations, at least in North America today, and that has caused division in Reformed and Presbyterian churches today. The explanation of that is that beginning about the year 2000, a theological movement emerged first in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in the United States, centering about the faculty of Westminster Theological Seminary, a seminary with great influence in Presbyterian and Reformed Christian circles, certainly in North America today. And this movement, calling itself the Federal Vision, which means the covenant vision, in fact, is developing the conditional doctrine of the covenant that the Protestant Reformed churches struggled with in the 1950s and repudiated. This movement is developing and promoting the doctrine of the conditional covenant, and the development is such that this movement denies eternal election explicitly, denies limited atonement explicitly, denies irresistible grace explicitly, and denies the perseverance of the saints explicitly. And you'll recognize that those are 4 of the 5 points of Calvinism that all Presbyterians and all Reformed people are pledged and bound to believe and to defend. The Federal Vision denies those 4. I'm sure that an argument could be made that they deny the other 5th point as well. Anytime any salvation is conditional, total depravity is called into question, but I'll let that go for now. This movement denies at least those 4 cardinal truths of the Christian faith and of the Reformed religion, specifically with regard to the baptized children of believing parents. And it denies those cardinal doctrines in this way. According to the Federal Vision, God elects all the physical children of believing parents, elects them unto salvation. Some of those children, nevertheless, perish because God's election is conditional. A conditional election. That was close to the heart of the Arminian heresy that the Reformed churches condemned in the canons of Dort in 1618 and 1619. Likewise, the Federal Vision maintains in so many words, and in that book, I believe maybe it's in the Covenant of God and the Children of Believers, but it could also be in the Battle for Sovereign Grace and the Covenant, that I quote a leading theologian of the Federal Vision, that Christ died for every child of believing parents, without exception. If not, because you can't limit these things just to the sphere of the covenant, you have to apply them eventually to the whole world. If not for every human being without exception, Christ died for them all, but his death is conditional, depends upon the infant child's accepting that redemption when he grows up. Similarly, God certainly has a gracious attitude toward every child of believing parents. If he does not begin the work of grace in the heart of every believing child, but that grace may fail to save that child. It's a frustrating grace. It's a resistible grace. And then obviously this movement teaches as well that although God establishes his covenant with every child, and they're open about it, begins to give gracious gifts of salvation to every child. Because the child fails to fulfill the condition, the child does not persevere in that salvation and in that grace and goes lost. Now it becomes evident, 60 years later, after the Protestant Reformed churches dealt with this very same teaching, the Declaration of Principles, how important that struggle was, if only they would see it, for the entire Reformed community, and how important this document is for the entire Reformed community in the struggle with the federal vision. It is not surprising that an error that cropped up and was dealt with in a limited way at that time comes to its full expression some 60 years later. Things like that have happened before in history. In 325 AD, the church dealt with the Arian heresy and condemned it, but at the Council of Nicaea, and then only one man really took a stand, saw the issues, and saw the church's confession of the truth at that time. Following that decision, for some 60 years, there was lively controversy throughout the entire Christian church over that issue, and really the decision that was made at Nicaea was rejected by much of the nominal Christian church and by many of the theologians of the church. And it was only in 381, about 60 years later, that at the Council of Constantinople, Nicaea was affirmed and established as the confession of the church's truth.
Maybe the tide will turn.
God grant it.
Professor, in researching for this book, The Battle for Sovereign Grace in the Covenant, you were covering material which you've been working with for some time and through your ministry, important issues. But in your research, did you come up with anything particularly fresh now to you? Something that you, didn't understand that, some particular insights or so that you'd like to share with us now? Anything come to mind?
With regard to the subject of the two books that we're examining together at this stage, I would say that in recent years I have learned clearly, as I did not know so clearly before, that the issue of the relation of election and the covenant has been a recurring controversial issue in the church from the time of the Reformation on. And that outstanding champions and certain denominations of churches even over the years have taught that election and the covenant are related, and they are related closely, and that they are related closely in this way, that election governs the covenant, so that the covenant children of God are not all of the physical children of believing parents without exception, but the elect children of believing parents. At the same time, we proclaim the good news that God is pleased to cast his line of election. Now I'm quoting a Puritan. God is pleased to cast his line of election in the generation of believers and their children. So that's one thing that I have learned. The Protestant Reformed churches have nothing to be ashamed of in their doctrine of the covenant and the government of the covenant by election with regard to the tradition of the Universal Church of Jesus Christ. We represent the main line of the teaching of the Reformed churches. And in spite of the fact that the majority probably of Presbyterian and Reformed theologians and churches dissent from us, doesn't detract from that. They're not in the main line of the tradition of the Orthodox doctrine of the relation of the covenant and election.
Let's say, Professor, there's a Christian lady who's watching this program or this video right now, pregnant with her first child, or a Christian lady with small infants. And she's heard this material and she's thinking to herself, now how does this make a difference to me in viewing my child in the womb or bringing up little ones in the name of Jesus Christ? How would you address that issue and that putative person?
The practical implications of the truth of this matter are enormous. This pregnant mother, or this mother with little ones, must not view her unborn child or her family of small children as little vipers slithering around in her womb or in her home, upon whom she must address calls to an experiential conversion later on when they grow up. And she may not leave them out of the family devotions. That's another practical implication of those who look at their children as unsaved or as little vipers. They don't participate in the family prayers. They may pray, "Our Father who art in heaven," because God isn't their Father in heaven. And when these churches establish Christian schools, they forbid the teachers to pray that prayer, the Lord's Prayer, with the children, because they're little vipers, unsaved children. And they impress this upon the children so that they grow up thinking of themselves that way. And if they are that, why not live that way? And you have that desperate effect of that teaching as well. She must herself view them and address them as covenant saved children of God, and teach them to honor their parents, to pray, to love God, to serve God, to believe in Jesus Christ, because by God's grace they are covenant children. And at the same time, from early years, I practiced this, and my wife did with our own 9 children, make plain to them that not every child of believing parents is necessarily an elect, born-again child of God, and that they may presume in unbelief and disobedience upon a covenant salvation. That's a warning against unbelief and against disobedience. But call them from early years on to believe in Jesus Christ, and assure them that everyone who does believe in Jesus Christ shall be saved. To call them to obey God for God's sake, for which there will be a reward. This view of children in the covenant does in no way rule out a lively call to them to believe in Jesus Christ, and thus to know their salvation and their election, or warnings against unbelief and disobedience. So in child rearing, it makes a world of difference. And I believe that the practical effects of this difference are evident also. I don't care to go into that, but I've had some experience with young people who have been raised in the churches that teach them that they're little vipers and that they're unsaved. These children take that to heart. And when they grow up, they show themselves to be big vipers. Little vipers become big vipers and show utter disdain for the church and the means of grace.
Seems to me that view that you can't tell your children to pray Our Father which art in heaven is an awful reading of the Gospels. Since Jesus Christ taught when he took those little infants up and blessed them and said, of such is the kingdom of heaven, that then Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. They're part of the kingdom. The kingdom comes in them as well as in us. And then what are you going to do? Are you going to have them bow their heads even? Are you going to have them at the table?
They may listen, I suppose, but they are made to know that they are outside of the covenant and regarded as unsaved. And they're not allowed to pray, Our Father who art in heaven.
That's battle for sovereign grace in the covenant, the declaration of principles, and the covenant of God and the children of believers, a vitally important doctrine and truth for the viewing and rearing of our children.